A good day to you. It is Monday morning, July 23rd. This sermon recap is for Proper 11, the year B, the year of Mark, preached at University Lutheran, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. This recap, you're actually going to get a bit more than what the sermon was able to hold yesterday. And the very best thought of what I thought these sermon recaps would be is that you get a bit of background. A couple weeks back, when the text was in front of us from Mark 6, where Herod, there's this flashback in Mark of Herod killing John the Baptist. One of the commentators moved really hard to have us find some kind of empathy or sympathy, or that we should find some kind of common thread with Herod and see him as one of the characters of Mark and the way Mark writes his gospel. And I didn't do much with that until now this past week, the tragic events, the killings in Colorado, or Colorado with the gunman in the theater at the Batman premiere. And so with that tragic event happening and needing to be at least addressed, and yet I wanted to focus this sermon on our campus ministry here at University Lutheran in this series of breaking that we're known in the breaking of the bread, that we break our bread and share it with those who are students on the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire campus. But that I backed up, and that suddenly I saw in Mark something that I've missed before, and maybe I'm making more of it than what's there. But there seems to be in Mark this building toward this inevitable collision between the brokenness of who we are, the allness of that, and the brokenness of who Jesus is and being known in the brokenness and how that heals us. That there is this meeting that's going to happen between the momentum of how Mark writes his gospel, of what we bring to the Christ and what Christ brings to us. And so Mark's gospel begins with one person with leprosy, one person who is paralyzed, and yet his friends lower him down through the roof of the place where Jesus is, and Jesus stacks up their faith. He counts the faith of the friends and adds it to the faith of the one who is paralyzed and says, "Your faith has made you well," and heals the man. And then we have the healing of the man who's possessed with the demon that's called Legion. And so you get this growing and growing Legion, 1 and 1 and 1 and 4 and Legion, and suddenly there's a crowd, and the woman who touches the very fringe of Jesus' robe and healed. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples said, "Well, how can we know who touched you? We're surrounded by a throng, a crowd of people." And then he raises Jairus' daughter in Mark, and so this crowd goes along, and yet he puts the crowd outside, and he goes in and says and whispers to the little girl, "Talitha cum," little girl, get up, and she's raised. And then you get this where Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2, and they do healings, and this furor, this noise, this throng of people begins to grow and grow and grow. And then you get this flashback because Herod, king, son of Herod the Great, who rebuilt the temple, hears all this noise about this Jesus and says, "It must be John whom I beheaded. It must be John risen from the dead." That all this noise and all these crowds and all this commotion and all this momentum of this Jesus of Nazareth brings Herod to the place where, even by his own hand, he understands his own brokenness. The commentators said that at the place where Herod was greatest as king, and he celebrates a birthday, and he has all these important people come from Rome and from the Jewish authorities and from the religious authorities, when he's at his very greatest pomp and circumstance and posturing, is when he is at his most vulnerable because his wife, his brother's wife, Herodias, and his daughter, his stepdaughter, who is niece, apply some pressure that they should have the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And even though Herod doesn't want to do it, because he somehow admires John, he's perplexed by John, intrigued by John, goes to listen to John, that he finds himself broken, and he beheads John. So that then when this commotion continues about this Jesus, you get this picture of Herod somehow kind of plagued, cursed by the actions of his own hand. So that all of that builds in this one who is powerful and throws a feast at the beheading of John. Now suddenly you have one who is Christ, who throws a feast of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark over and against this brokenness and this need of healing that continues to ramp up in Mark and is met by this feeding of the 5,000. So yesterday's text again from Mark, we got the piece right before the feeding of the 5,000, and we got the piece right after the feeding of the 5,000. Again, next week in the Gospel of John, we switch to the Gospel of John, that we should hear the feeding of the 5,000 being known in the breaking of the bread and the multiplication of breads and loaves. And then we will spend all of August thinking about, listening to, hearing what John has to say about this Jesus who is bread of life. This Jesus comes in our text yesterday in Mark and sees these people, and it says he has compassion on them because they are sheep without a shepherd. That this growing crowd has gathered. They've rushed ahead of Jesus and his disciples. They take a boat across the sea, and they've run ahead, and there they are waiting for Jesus and bringing Jesus all their sick and those who are in need of healing. And then the gospel again skips the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and the crowd begins and continues to grow and grow because Jesus feeds them, and they continue to bring Jesus their sick from all the farms and villages and towns, wherever Jesus is, so that they should even just touch the fringe of his robe. And Mark says those who touch the fringe are healed. That in the midst of our brokenness, all of us desire to be healed. That I've had this running conversation with my daughter and a friend that behind this veneer, this thin veneer that is all of us, that looks like our life is under control and that our life is smooth, and that our life and our faith and our hope and our joy is somehow under control. That right behind that thin veneer, all of us, at least most of the time, are scrambling to make sense of all the pieces that are the world, all the pieces that is faith, all the pieces that is God in our life, all the pieces of who Jesus is as Messiah, all the pieces when someone walks into a theater with some delusional thought that he is a villain from a comic book series and kills little children and somehow portends to feel powerful by that all these pieces behind this tiny veneer, all of us are trying to make sense of life and suffering and death and joy and love and hate. And Jesus comes and has compassion on us. That so Herod says in this growing popularity of Jesus, it must be John, this John that I took off his head. And at the feast of these important people, here comes John's head on a platter. And Jesus responds to that at the gathering of this throng. And he feeds with bread and fish and breaks the bread and is known in the breaking of the bread. Mark keeps saying that he is recognized, that Jesus is recognized in these days, and they bring folks to Jesus that he should heal them. One little treat. This is known as a talitz. Some folks here in town were willing to loan this to me for my sermon yesterday. This is something that a Jewish person, a Jewish male typically, but sometimes females, they get on their bar mitzvah, or they get on their wedding day, that there is a text from Deuteronomy and Numbers that says, make for yourself a cloth, and on each of the four corners there should be these fringes, tzitzis they're called, and that this prayer shawl for a Jewish person serves many purposes. Each fringe has 5 knots for the 5 books of Torah, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Scripture, that they should be reminded of the covenant that God has made with them. But lots of images come from this talitz, this cloth. You get you get the sense of tent. That's why this couple that loaned this to me, they were married underneath this talitz. It was stretched out, and they made their covenant to one another under it. It has the sense of a prayer closet, so that when Jesus says in Matthew, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, but go into your closet and pray. That's this, that you were never expected to go where you keep your vacuum and pray, or your brooms, or your extra shoes. But the last one that I actually borrowed this for is that it has the sense of wings. I can't walk around and have you see that with the camera where it's at, but to walk with this, you get the sense of wings. And there is a text in Micah that says, when the Son of Righteousness comes, there will be healing in his wings. And so when the woman in Mark approaches Jesus and touches the fringe of his robe and is healed, and Jesus says, "Who touched me?" It sounds like he's angry. It sounds like he's accusing, but he wants to know who has faith. He wants to know who has understood the text in Micah, that Jesus, in being the Son of Righteousness, that Jesus being the fulfillment of God's love and covenant and promise, that there is healing in his wings. And so that when Jesus feeds the 5,000, they bring their sick to him, and those who touch the tassels, the very fringe of his robe, they are healed. That Jesus brings healing, that Jesus has compassion, and that compassion makes in Jesus two things. He teaches them 5 books of Pentateuch, 5 books of Torah, and he feeds them bread. And so my last point yesterday, in the midst of acknowledging all of our brokenness, that we're known sometimes by the brokenness of our brokenness, is that Jesus is known in the breaking of the bread, and having compassion, he does 2 things. He teaches with the word, and he feeds them. The church at its very best, and for us here in this place, in campus ministry, in providing meals and Bible study and gathering place for college students, those 2 things. That we give word with bread and bread with word. That certainly bread can be given anywhere, and that's a good thing. Jesus says, whomever gives a cup of cold water will not lose a reward. And anybody can take up a bullhorn and proclaim word. But somehow, Jesus, in our needing to be healed of our brokenness, teaches us in his compassion and feeds us in his compassion. That the tyranny of that was Herod, and the tyranny that is a fellow who walks into a theater, their feast and their hunger causes in us brokenness. A brokenness by the fact that we simply are. A brokenness by the things that we do. A brokenness by the things that we don't do at all, that we had nothing to do with, like those people that simply went to a movie and are now dead, or now mourn the loss of someone else. A brokenness that simply because we are human and in this frail creation. But that Jesus meets us with a healing. And one last thing. So on campus ministry, bread and word, word and bread. And in those things, there is this careful seeing and compassion of 1 and 2 and 10 and 20 and 14,000 across the street who come to be on this college campus. The last, and this wasn't part of yesterday's sermon either, but they bring all these folks to Jesus, that even if they touch the fringe of his cloak, Mark says, all who touched it were healed. The word there for healed is saved. That this Jesus who is known in the breaking of the bread, in this meeting of the brokenness of who we are, that is Herod, and the feasting, that is the killing of John the Baptist, and in this coming of who Jesus is as Messiah, as Son of Righteousness, with healing in his wings, whose feast is life, whose feast is bread, whose feast is word that heals, that saves. Grace and peace to you all things. Be blessed this day.